Well, first of all, I'd like to just say thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. And I've met a few of you already, and it's been really great to kind of get and visit with you. Don't make it to talk to tons of California people all the time, so it's nice when I get a little different perspective than Midwest. So just to kind of start out, how many of you feel like you're pretty familiar with EPDs? Okay, quite a few of you. Okay, so some of this may be a little bit of review as we're getting started, but hopefully there'll be a few things in here that maybe you didn't already know. It's registering, it's just not moving. Okay, I can do that.
Hang on, it did too.
Oh, here we go. Oh, that's perfect.
Okay.
Thanks. I'll just press. Okay, so sort of the obvious thing when we think about selection is often...
It's working, so it's your slide loads.
Oh, okay.
Here we go.
Big pictures. All right. Sorry about that. So often I think when we think about selection, sort of the obvious thing to think about is phenotypic selection. So I kind of like to start this presentation here and then dial it into some of the specific genetic tools that we have that are really important. So if we think about these two goals here, if we had them in the same sort of environment, we might be really tempted to make some sort of snap judgments about those individuals. But we may have those individuals in very different types of environments. And that's really what some of these genetic tools attempt to do, is sort of remove that environmental piece and really focus on the genetic merit of those individuals specifically so that we can make better selection decisions. So if we take a look at phenotypes or how the animals perform, it's really a combination of genetics and environment. So one of the goals is to sort of figure out how we get at that genetic component separate from that environmental component. So if we think about phenotypes, these are things like the animal's performance. So what are some examples of phenotypes that we might use or see? Calving ease, sure, that's a great one. Growth, weaning weight, perfect. Those are all fantastic examples. So things like actual weights, anything we might go out and actually physically record on those animals, or even things like weight ratios would all be examples of phenotypes. So if we think about environment, these are going to be things like management decisions that we make, or temporary environmental effects that we may experience on the ranch. So what would be some examples there? Fire. Fire destroying all your forage, yes. Snow, that's another great example. So some other examples would be things like drought, age of dam, or whether we choose to creep feed or not. All of those would be different decisions that we could make that would influence the phenotype of those animals, or things that happen by chance in a particular year that influence the phenotype of those animals. So if we try to drill down into that genetics component, what we're really getting at is heritable variation that we pass on reliably to the next generation. And so when we think about those types of tools, we're going to be thinking about EPDs and indexes. So I'm really going to focus a lot on EPDs today. All right, so we already kind of discussed the fact that if we have weights, those are phenotypes. So if we have something like a raw weight, we're really looking at just a raw phenotype. Now, if we think about things like weight ratios that people sometimes like to use, those are really phenotypes where we control for environment within a specific group. So we can compare those within a group, but it's really difficult to sort of make those comparisons across groups because we may have different levels of genetic ability or different environments across different groups. So if we really want to drill into genetics and be able to look at that across environments, one of the things we would probably be really interested in would be EPDs. So the real question is, if we're going to use EPDs, how do we use them effectively? Because one of the challenges is there are a heck of a lot of them. And when you start to think about making genetic progress in something like 15 or 20 or even 25 different traits at any one specific time, A, it becomes really overwhelming, and B, you're really not going to make any progress anyway when you're trying to select on so many different things. So one of the really important steps that I like to sort of work with people on is really developing a breeding objective. And once we have that objective, that really tells us which of those traits we need to focus on so that we can actually make progress in those traits and make some sort of economic impact for those producers. So I sort of think of a breeding objective as like a mission statement. So thinking about what we do well, what maybe we want to change, or things that we want to do differently in the future. We need to be thinking about whether we have terminal breeding systems versus systems where we're keeping replacement females within the herd. Thinking about when and where we're going to market those animals, and what sort of resources we have available. So we may have limits in terms of forage or water resources. We may have limits in terms of labor resources, particularly if people are working sort of a second or a main job and working with the cattle sort of in the evenings. You know, maybe going out and pulling calves at 3 o'clock in the morning is not something anybody wants to do, but you probably really don't want to do it if you have to get up first thing in the morning and go to some other job, or potentially have those coming during the day when you really aren't there to address those issues. So when I think about objectives, I first think about figuring out what we want to do, picking a breed that really makes sense to achieve those objectives, and then dialing in to the EPDs that are available within that breed to sort of make those decisions. So I have a couple of examples here. These certainly aren't the only way you could go or the only traits you might want to focus on, but just a couple of examples. So let's say I'm a producer and I keep replacements. I sell my calves at weaning, and I have sort of a low input type of environment. I don't have a lot of resources available to me. So I might be interested in things like, let's say I chose Limousine as the breed I wanted to use. There are a few less EPDs in that breed compared to some of the other breeds. If we had chosen Red Angus, we might be interested in heifer pregnancy or maintenance energy. We don't have those things available in Limousine. So instead we might focus on sort of getting as much weaning weight as we can, moderating levels of milk and mature size by selecting on milk and yearling weight EPDs, and probably calving these maternal because we're going to be keeping replacement females out of that. If we're going to breed to heifers, obviously we also need to think about calving these direct. But if we consider a different scenario, maybe I'm purchasing crossbred replacement females, so I'm really not worried about maternal traits at all in this scenario. And I'm going to retain ownership of my calves and sell them on a high quality grade or market. So in that case, I'm really going to be interested in calving these direct to make sure I get live calves on the ground and really focus on carcass traits. And I might have chosen Angus as the breed I wanted to use. So lots of different ways you can achieve sort of the same objective. But the choice of breed does influence which EPDs you're going to have available to use in those scenarios. So we've talked a lot about EPDs, but I haven't yet defined them. So this is where I'm going to do that. So EPD stands for expected progeny difference, and it's really how good is this animal likely to be as a parent. And it's really about looking at average difference between the performance of progeny. So if I have two bulls here and I bred them to the same set of cows, what difference would I expect in the average performance of those calves? And that's really what those EPDs are reflecting. So the fact that it's a 30 or a 35 or a 3,256 really makes absolutely no difference. It's all about the comparison of those values across animals or across an entire breed. So we'll look at a couple examples of that here in a minute. So for example, we've got a sire here we're thinking about purchasing. His EPD is 30. And this of course tells us absolutely nothing because I don't know what trait it is. I don't have anything to compare that number to. And since it's all about a relative value, just the value in and of itself isn't really very meaningful. Where we can really start to develop meaningful information from this is in comparing two different animals. So if we have that same individual now, we know it's weaning weight in this example, and one's a 30 and one's a 40. Anybody know what we would expect in the difference of their progeny? Yeah, 10 pounds of weaning weight. So we would expect that calves out of sire B would average about 10 pounds heavier at weaning if we bred them to the same set of cows. So there we can start to extract meaningful information from those numbers. And the other way we can really do that is sort of comparing an animal within its rank within the breed. And I sort of like this comparison, or sometimes both of these comparisons, because I could have given you the two worst bulls right there in the entire breed, right? So one's 10 pounds better than terrible, and the other one's 10 pounds less than terrible, right? So knowing where those bulls rank within the breed can also be a really important tool to sort of understand the value of those animals. So if we said that weaning weight EPD of 30 was in the top 25% of the breed, we would expect that about 1 out of 4 bulls would sire calves with heavier weaning weights if we bred them to the same set of cows. And so one of the questions I got a lot in extension was, how on earth do I find those numbers? So unfortunately, they're really large tables, but they're really easy to find. If you're interested in finding those, you just Google the breed and percentile rank table, and it'll almost always bring it up in the very first hit. And all you really need to do is take, let's say we've got a weaning weight EPD of 65 here, and we want to figure out where that ranks within the Simmental breed. And this would be for purebred Simmentals. So we just find our weaning weight column there, and we start to scan down until we see a number that's equal to or less than 65, which would be that one right there. And then we just follow it over and we see it's in the 40th percentile. So top 40% of the breed gives us some additional information other than just comparing bull or heifer EPDs directly. So the system in which we get EPDs is often called National Cattle Evaluation, and sometimes called genetic prediction, but the idea is that we want to be able to take data from all across the country, and in some cases multiple countries, and be able to produce these EPD values so that we can better compare animals on not just a regional or local scale, but on a national scale. So across a wide variety of different environments. And so some of the principles of EPDs are to sort of try and correct for or account for differences in environment, differences in management practices, differences in genetic merits of the mates of those animals, to try and come up with that EPD value that accurately describes the genetic merit of that individual. So one of the important things if people are turning in data is to really think about contemporary grouping. Now, contemporary grouping is where we start off to get those weight ratios that we talked about at the very beginning, so those phenotypes. But those phenotypes feed into the evaluation and serve a really important role because they sort of let us compare and control environmental differences within a group so that then we can compare those individuals within that group, and then we'll talk about how we can compare them across groups, but not directly in the case of the ratio. So we might be interested in things like taking a single breeder. So that would be sort of the largest level of a contemporary group would be all the calves that a single breeder produces in a year. And then we might go to the year and then season within that year. So we're sort of making that group a little bit smaller now and trying to really dial down to animals that were raised in the same type of environment. So then we might think about sex, whether they're bull or heifer calves, the breed composition, however we managed those cows from, say, birth to weaning. And then if we have different embryo transfer calves or things like that, those would typically go in a separate contemporary group. So trying to really get as large a group as we can possibly get so that we have as many of those ratios to compare within that group, but then really making sure that whatever we do include in that group are really raised under the same type of environmental conditions. And this is why that's important, as well as turning in as much data as possible, and wherever possible, all of the information on the entire calf crop. So here I have a calf crop of only 10, and we're looking at adjusted 205-day weaning weights, and the average is 625 pounds out of these 10 calves. So we take a look, and these 5 here are going to be a little bit below average. We can see from this ratio, 100 will be average. Anything below 100 is a little bit below average. Anything above 100 is above average. And so we've got 5 that are below average and 5 that are above average. So if we had decided instead that we cared more about what our mean weaning weight was than reporting all of the data, what we would actually end up doing to ourselves is shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak, in that let's say we just reported the 5 calves that were above average because we wanted our adjusted weaning weight to be a little bit higher, right? Bragging rights. So now our average weaning weight is 675 pounds, but all these animals were above average before when we compared them to all of the calves. But now 3 of our calves are below average and only 2 of them are above average because we only reported part of the data. So anytime within these national cattle evaluation systems, we can sort of get data on the entire herd. It's helpful for the evaluation, but it's also helpful for the producer who's going to get more accurate information. So the other, one of the underlying principles of national cattle evaluation is using sort of reference sires. So in this case, we have 3 different herds, and we have a bull A that has been used in all of those herds, so maybe an AI sire. And then we have a few different cleanup sires, bull B, C, and D, that are used within each herd only. So the fact that we have calves out of bull A in that herd really lets us start to make some of those comparisons across herds, and that's the sort of information that gets pulled into that national cattle evaluation to start to sort of adjust out some of those environmental effects. So the other value associated with EPDs that often gets forgotten, I think, are the EPD accuracies, and they're actually really, really important management tools. So of course we've got a bull here, EPDs on the top, accuracies on the bottom, and we're going to talk a little bit about those accuracies. So EPDs in the traditional sense, so Allison's going to talk about how genomics fits into that piece, but to begin with, let's just talk about our traditional EPD evaluation where we have pedigree data. So when we have this pedigree data, when we start off and a calf was born, hits the ground, what we have in terms of EPD is a parent average. So it's exactly what it sounds like. We take half of the EPD of the sire and half of the EPD of the dam, and we add them together. So in principle, what this means is that if we have a group of full sib embryo flush mates, for example, they have the exact same EPD, which poses a little bit of a challenge that genomics can address, as well as recording additional data on those individuals themselves, or later on, progeny records. But when we start out, it's just an average of whatever the parents' EPDs are. But in reality, what each animal gets is that average plus some deviation from that average. And that's called the Mendelian sampling term, and that's what this is. And all that means is that when gametes are created, and when we bring those gametes together and have fertilization and the calf results from that, they have a different sampling of genes. So it's possible that a sperm or an egg got every single bad allele that parent had to provide. And if you're me, that's what happens, right? So it's possible that you got that, and we really need to subtract a lot off that parent average in order to sort of better reflect that animal's true genetic merit. Now, if you're really lucky, that animal could get the sperm or the egg that has every single good allele that parent had to provide, in which case we need to add a little bit to this. But in principle, the average is a pretty good place to start because most of the gametes will get kind of an average sampling of genes. And we'll look at a figure on that here in a little bit. So, how many of you have like a weird sibling? I do. Yeah, any of you with your hands not raised? It's you. So my brother's the weird one. He's like tall and artistic, and you know, I'm short and nerdy, so that makes me sound like the weird one. But I'm gonna go with he's the weird one. And that's because we have different sampling of genes, right? And so even when we think about sort of low levels of recombination and things like that, there's still an incredibly large number of potential genetically distinct full siblings. And that's why sort of having some additional information to sort of deviate from that parent average can be really important. So most of the time our gametes are going to be about average. So our parent average is a pretty good assumption to start out with. That's where most of our sampling is going to be, pretty close to average. But here's our example where, you know, I got really unlucky and I had the terrible, terrible gametes. And here's our example where we have really fantastic gametes, right? So the accuracy is all about how well we have estimated that EPD based on how much information is in that evaluation. And it's really boils down to being a risk management tool. So let's take a look at that example I used earlier. So we have some full sib flush mates. Every single one of them has, let's say, a parent average weaning weight EPD of 25. Okay? So sire was 30, dam was 20. We just average it. We get 25. So all 5 of those full sibs are going to have a weaning weight EPD of 25. until we record, for example, their own performance. And once we record their own performance, we now have a little bit of information where we can start to figure out what sampling of genes they actually received. And when we have that, some of those EPDs may change whenever we add information into the evaluation, but whenever we add information into the evaluation, the accuracy is always going to go up. So the EPD changes a little bit, accuracy always goes up. And to get an idea of sort of how many progeny records go into a high accuracy bull, I put this table up here. So don't worry about what's on the left-hand column necessarily, because that's simply a correlation. But here's our BIF accuracies, and those are what are reported in semen catalogs and by breed association. So that's typically the accuracy value that we're interested in. And the number of records required to sort of hit specific levels of accuracy depends on the trait heritability. So lowly heritable traits, we need more records because the genetics piece is a little bit smaller in each of those phenotypic records than if we have really highly heritable traits like carcass traits. So you can kind of look down this table and see that we can get fairly moderate levels of accuracy with a reasonable number of progeny records. This is ignoring the animal's own record and pretending like it's not there, contributing to the accuracy. So in principle, they'll be a little bit higher than this. But once we get to these really highly proven animals, there's a heck of a lot of data that's going into these predictions. But I mentioned before, the accuracy is really our risk management tool, and this is why. And it relates to the fact that those EPDs change over time. So particularly if we're thinking about something that might be a really critical selection decision, so making sure that we have a high calving knee sire to breed to our heifers in a particular year, for example. If we use a low accuracy bull, which we can do, even if it has a really fantastic calving knees EPD, we know that it can change a little bit because it's on the lower end of that accuracy scale. So it's a little bit higher risk decision than it would be if we came over here and used maybe a more highly accurate AI sire for that particular mating, as an example. So really, I think about the accuracies as a risk management tool and sort of balancing risk in our selection decisions, because sometimes that EPD may go up a lot, right, if we got that good sampling. So sometimes it pays to use those lower accuracy sires, but we need to acknowledge that it's a little bit riskier decision because it could also go the other direction. Whereas when we get to these accuracy values over here, it's much more of a known quantity. And we can actually figure out how much these EPDs are likely to change over time if we're interested in really dialing into that risk. So one way to do that is to look at possible change values. So here's an Angus bull, and this is what his values were in the 1996 sire summary. And we're going to focus on his birth weight EPD. So it's an accuracy of 0.71 right now, so pretty highly accurate. We wouldn't expect that value to change a lot over time. But if we want to look at what exactly that could change to, we can look at possible change values. So how confident are we in this EPD? So in the same way you can find those EPD percentile rank tables, if you Google a breed and possible change table, most of your major breed associations will have these possible change tables that let you look these up. And what these principally let you do is develop 68% confidence intervals around the EPD. So that was a birth weight EPD, and it was at close to a 0.7 accuracy. So we look over in the table here, we can see that's 0.79 is our possible change value. All right, so if you want to figure this out, you take the EPD, we've got the accuracy and the possible change value associated with it. So to develop that confidence interval, all we do is we take the EPD minus the possible change value right here, 0.79, and then we take the EPD plus that possible change value, and that's our 68% confidence interval. So we're 68% confident that the true breeding value, or EPD, for this animal is going to fall between negative 0.09 and 1.49. So a pretty small range, right? About a little less than 2 pounds of change here. So that high accuracy shows us that there's not a lot of possible change that we would expect here. Now you can actually develop 95% confidence intervals if you want by just taking 2 times that possible change value and doing the exact same calculation. And there we have about a 3-pound spread. Yeah, about a 3-pound spread there. So now if we go and sort of see how accurate we were in this particular instance, we look at his birth weight value from the 2010 evaluation, and it was a 2. So it went up a little bit. And now we're at an accuracy of 0.98 and a possible change that's very, very small. But we did fall, we missed the 68% confidence interval by a little bit, but we fell right within that 95% confidence interval. So those values really give you a way to sort of calculate what the risk is. And for these high accuracy bulls, it's going to be fairly small, but when you start to calculate something like having these direct on a yearling herd sire, those intervals can be pretty darn large. So if we want to build accuracy, the things we really need to focus on are turning in good production records on the individuals themselves, and then any progeny that they have, if we have seed stock producers. And then genomic testing is another option to increase accuracy that Allison will talk to you about here shortly. So I'm going to tie this all together with a bit of a strange example, and the people that know me know I really like strange examples, so bear with me. So usually I talk right before lunch, and people are really hungry, so I like talking about cheese and crackers. So pretend you didn't just have a big breakfast, and you're really hungry. And our sort of gold standard, if we wanted a snack, would be a big stack of cheese and crackers, right? Unfortunately, what we usually have in the absence of using AI sires is we just have a cracker, right? Oh, we got the cracker. It works. It's good. And in fact, it's the absolute best estimate that we have for the genetic merit of that individual, because we've accounted for and pulled in information on the individual itself if we had it, its relatives, pulled in information from that pedigree structure. All of that is sort of in that EPD value in one single value, so we really don't have to think about those individual components a lot, which is why it's kind of attractive. So even if it's low accuracy, it's still the best estimate for genetic merit that we have. But it's just a cracker in this case. So if we want to maybe think about starting our stack, one of the things we could think about is using a genomic test, useful in that genetic evaluation system, has some holes, doesn't explain all of the variation, but if we sort of add those two pieces together, that's where we start to find value in a little bit higher accuracy EPD. And then the better the test, the more accuracy we get out of that. So the bigger the stack of our cheese and crackers. Now, if we keep that animal and continue recording data on the progeny, we get a little bit bigger stack, and then finally we get to our gold standard, which is going to be that high accuracy EPD on a proven bull that really has lots and lots of data in that evaluation, as we saw in that chart before. And so if you're interested in learning more, I think Allison's going to talk a little bit more about eBEEF, but I just put a screenshot of the main page there to kind of direct you to that resource if you have questions or would like to learn more.